Hello, my name is Tom, and this is a level that I've made to show off a few things about Kismet that I found interesting when I was learning. One feature is how to turn a rigid body into an object that can trigger the opening of a door and prevent the player from opening the door. The second thing is to learn how to spawn a bot in the level such that it will not shoot at you unless it sees you using a trace action, and when it kills you, it will stop firing. Another feature that we are going to look at is how to make the bot so that it will die and not send off any Kismet errors due to delays in the Kismet not finding a handler. Final thing is how to make it so when you get to the end of your level to open up a new map or to go back to the game menu. This video hinges on showing you a few particular features of UDK. So it assumes that you already know how to substantiate static meshes into your level from the content browser. It assumes you know how to set lighting and build the lighting, and it assumes you know a little bit of Kismet already. We're pretty much turning around a few key features. The first feature is how to make a rigid body activate a trigger and to prevent the player from doing so. To create a rigid body, you find it in the browser as a static mesh. You right click in your scene, go add actor and choose UT rigid body, and it'll be there. Let's just delete that one. Then in Kismet, because it's a rigid body, it'll already be functional. You cannot use a static mesh in Kismet, but you can use a rigid body straight off the bat. And you can see here we have assigned it to the trigger. When the trigger is touched, trigger here, when it is touched, it will open a matinee or play a matinee that sends off these two doors. And once the doors have opened, the rigid body will be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed in a flash of an eye. You could add some sort of particle system to make it kind of, explode or something, but we're keeping it simple. Now, one other thing to mention about this particular level is that we're using a trace action for a bot, which is behind the door, to shoot at us when it sees us. And these particular static meshes for the door, they have a hole in them, and the bot can actually see through the hole and shoot at you. So we've put a floating light. Show all. We've put a floating light to block that hole, and in order for it to follow the door, so it doesn't float in space, we had to add a level loaded. Probably should have a trigger count of 0. When the level is loaded, the light is attached to the door, which is this guy, and it'll follow it wherever it goes. And we did this for each of the doors, so we have the same setup with different interactors and different doors. When you set up the trigger, it has to be changed from its default, which is to work with the player, so that it works instead with the rigid body. The rigid body can be set to any of these guys, actually. Let's select it on the level. You see it's that one. But actually you can pick up any rigid body and it'll work, which is kind of strange, but let's not complain. The rigid body itself has to have a setting changed, and this is in its properties. You have to go to collision here and expand it out, and then turn off no encroach check. You can see why. It says if you want touch events from volumes or triggers, you need to set this to false. Okay, the trigger itself doesn't need any special settings defined in it. The trigger in the Kismet does need some things changed. In particular, you want to add an ignored class proximity, which is set to pawn, which, if you read the spelling, it is talking about player characters and bots. Further down in the properties of that trigger, you'll need to set it to use instigator and drag a line from instigator down to an object variable set to the rigid body. I set it to a max trigger count of 1 so that the door will only open once, and I've added a trigger comment which I've not put out to the screen, just so that we can see the trigger go off. Okay, and I've repeated I've copied and pasted the same trigger so that those settings are the same all the way through. So we only have to set up the ignored class proximity type once. Actually, we need to do it here. Just for the example, I'm going to show you working and not working. So let's play the level through just to show what it is we're trying to achieve. I'm going to play it in the editor. It says paths need to be rebuilt. Probably that's because I wiggled the path around. You can see the bot can still see through the gap in the door. which is not ideal. That's why it's firing at us. But it has stopped firing, you know. It's only if we get very, very close that it will notice us. Okay, so we need to, first of all, let's check whether the door will open when we touch it. Nope, it doesn't. Alright, so let's grab a rigid body, and for this I'm using the physics gun. We just pick it up, drag it around, drop it. This is using the right click, and we can left click on it to push it along. There's the trigger warning. We can get killed by the bot, that's completely okay. The reason to show that is so that we know that when it has shot us, it stops firing. The default action is that it keeps firing once it starts firing. Okay, so let's start playing again, and just shoot that guy. Alright, and when we move up to the next door, you'll see that it will open. Right, because the player has triggered it. So let's die, go back to Kismet, and change the settings for the second trigger so that it includes the pawn ignored class. Okay, and just so we don't have to do it later, let's do it for the third door as well. So now all our doors will not open when the player touches them. Okay, so that explains how to set up the rigid body so it will open the door. When the doors have opened, there's a destroy action, which you can find under new action, actor destroy. That is just simply going to destroy our rigid body. Let's talk about the bot now. Now, bots need to have path nodes or notes to have some sort of navigation. A note you can find under actor classes, and there's note there, and you go add note. If it's selected in the list, that'll be visible here. I've just used path nodes, which you can find just by going add actor path node, because they're quite commonly used. The bot will spawn off of this path node and just move up to this path node. Probably we won't notice that movement, but I find that it helps to have the bot moving a little bit when it spawns, just to prevent any possible respawning on the same spot where the bot is already there. Okay, let's have a look in the Kismet for the bot spawn. And you might think, that looks pretty complicated. And I suppose it is. Let's have a look at how it works. First off, we've created an object variable and given it a name, which is bot1, a var name. We've then created a named variable, which you create by going new variable, named variable, and named that so that it finds the variable name called bot. So anything which happens to these named variables is actually affecting the variable called bot1. This is a way to remote control your Kismet so you don't get wires going everywhere. We already have a lot of wires hooking up. If all of the wires are hooking into the bot, then they'll all be going up here or wherever it is, and it'll be very confusing. So I've kind of tried to simplify it down a little. I've used an actor factory X to spawn the bot. There's also an actor factory, but I don't really use that one very often. The actor factory X is kind of an easy one to handle. It has a spawn point, which is our path node in the level, and it has the object that is spawned. The object that is spawned is bot1, and what happens to bot1 when it's spawned is that it has a handler for when it dies, and it has a handler for if it's alive. It will trace from the bot to the player, and if it's not obstructed in that trace, it'll start firing at us. If it's obstructed, it'll stop. So if the doors are in the way, it'll stop firing. We also have an event which, if the bot is alive and it sees a victim, which is us, die, and the bot is, sorry, this needs to be kind of pulled down a bit. If the player is not alive, then it will start firing. Now the reason to put this in is the player is actually going to respawn straight away, and when they press the fire key, right? So until you press the fire key, the bot will stop firing. When you press the fire key, it's actually going to trace again and going to start shooting at you. Just so you know, when you create a actor factory X, you get a little blue triangle here, which lets you choose what kind of actor factory to use. And for a bot, we use actor factory AI. Now, personally, I don't know all of the ins and outs of this properties window, but I know that most of the time, to get the standard generic UT game UDK bot, you have to actually use UT bot and set the pawn class to UT pawn. If you choose the other ones, you tend to get nothing spawning in the level. but this seems to work fine. I also tend to give the bot a little name of some kind, like Barry or Bob or whatever. And I like to click on Give Default Inventory if it's going to be shooting at me. You can actually set an inventory list if you want it to have a specific kind of gun. You can see there's different weapons that it can have. But I think for what we're doing, default inventory is fine, which is a link gun. Okay, let's have a consideration of the trace node. The trace node is what we use to draw a line between the bot and the player, and it checks to see whether it can draw a line between them. If it can, it's set to start firing. The bot is the target, the player is who it fires at. Afterwards there's a delay. This is very important. If you don't have the delay, then this will happen at the start of the level. The bot won't see you because there's a door in the way, and it will never fire again. What you have to do is have a delay, and for when it's firing at you, we set the delay to like 1 second. So it'll fire at you for a second, and then it's going to trace again. So after every second of firing, it just checks to see whether it can still see you. If the view is obstructed, it stops firing, and it's only going to delay for 1/4 of a second before it checks again. So I can't see you, I check again, I can't see you, I check again. So this could potentially loop infinitely. It'll stop firing if its view is obstructed by the doorways, for example, and it'll also stop firing if it sees you die. Now setting up this particular Kismet is kind of a little confusing in this layout, mostly because I've doubled up on the bot node and the player node, but you have to add an action called attach to event. So here's what happens. When the bot spawns, it checks to see is the bot alive, and if it's true, then it will attach to this event here, which is see death. What it means is, has the bot seen anybody die? It'll specify that you are the victim and it was the killer. If you have died and the player is not alive, so it's set to false, it'll stop firing. When you die and you respawn, it'll send back to trace. If it can see you, it'll fire at you. So there's a little bit of complicated looping back and forward here, but with a nice clear screenshot, you can kind of see that once it's set up, it's a self-contained unit. Alright, there's some delays in the Kismet so that, when the trace happens, there's a delay before it happens again. There's also a delay from when the player is spawned to when it moves to the actor, and a delay at the end. These particular delays are good if you want the player to patrol along a course and loop back again. What happens if we were to play the level without this particular node? We'll play it now. Let's turn off Kismet and play.